It's Alex here for the Barbican Young Reviewers, and last night I saw my first ever live classical concert and was lucky enough for that to be Bernstein and Mahler First Symphonies conducted by Marin Alsop. The show was part of Bernstein 100, celebrating his centenary that's coming up next year. There are many things that link Bernstein and Mahler, despite them living in entirely different times. Both of them were incredibly gifted musically as children. Both were outsiders, and both believed that art and music should tell a story. And Marin Alsop, who was a protege of Bernstein and a powerhouse conductor, brought both of these symphonies to life. First up, we had Symphony No. 1, Jeremiah, by Bernstein himself, which is loosely based on the Book of Lamentations. The first movement of this piece began with very slow and very deep notes that created a very ominous sense. As the piece developed, it became clear that a call and answer was developing between the violins and the flutes, and the basses and cellos and brasses, which mimicked the conflict between Jeremiah and God, Jeremiah and the city of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Alsop acts like a go-between, arms flailing, trying to get somebody to listen, trying to get a compromise. The second movement, Profanation, tells the story of the ruin of the city of Jerusalem. The movement starts out with a light, airy motif played on the flute. However, rather than the warmth and comfort you would expect from this, it creates a sense of unease. Quickly, the movement transforms into one of destruction, the orchestra themselves acting as the weapons. The violinist played so ferociously that at one point his chair moved out behind him and I was sure he was about to fall off. Meanwhile, there was a double bassist who was plucking his strings so hard that his face was turning red, and it was almost quite scary to watch. In the third and final movement, Lamentations, the mezzo-soprano Jamie Barton, who is just here, walks onto the stage like an angel of death, but soon becomes more of a schoolmistress, the angry orchestra still behind her. She chides both them and the audience for enjoying the brutality of the second movement. Then, after a swell in the music where the orchestra plays full blast and Jamie Barton's voice on her own takes on this orchestra and wins, the piece becomes more soft and mournful. It's interesting that Bernstein himself said that in using the Book of Lamentations as inspiration, it was not one of literalness, but of emotional quality. The story he's telling can be linked to stories that are going on all around the world today, and for me that was very powerful and moving. Next up, we had Symphony No. 1 in D major, Titan by Mahler. Contrasting to the title of the piece, the first movement starts off incredibly lightly. It maintains this softness throughout and makes you feel very much at ease. With the flute and the oboe playing out a cuckoo's call and the violin's smooth and wandering long notes, you can't help but think of an English countryside, of nature waking up and dawn. The second movement felt the most classically classical to me. The orchestra play at a 3/4 time, transporting you to a ball, and you can't help but sway in your seat along to the music. For me, the third movement, aptly known as the Hunter's Funeral March, was the most interesting to listen to. The piece starts off incredibly uncomfortably, taking the childish tune of Frere Jacques and making it minor. It starts on the double bass, then moves to the bassoon, then the tubas, and finally the violin. The way it moves between them is as if it has a mind of its own, trying to find the right instrument to be played on. The movement blends mourning and beauty and celebration incredibly well. It brought to life a snowy landscape, a coffin with the hunter being dragged along it, and all his animals running behind. The piece fades slowly, the coffin getting further and further away in the distance. Suddenly, Alsop brings in the fourth movement with a loud crash of the cymbals and a thunderous roll on the timpani, telling the audience that this movement is going to be as stormy as the title suggests. This piece plays around with the audience's expectations. The piece starts with a bang, fades, and builds at a steady pace as you would expect. Then suddenly, the orchestra crescendos and recedes again, and again and again and again, until the final fanfare ends the piece. And in doing so, the tension keeps on building and rising, creating the thrilling experience of this piece. But for some people who aren't aware of Mahler's work, this could become quite frustrating, especially since Alsop herself becomes one of the players. Her mannerisms mimic the orchestra, and you really do believe that the climax is about to arrive, and then doesn't again and again. But for me, that made the real climax even more astounding. Although these two pieces are so different, They are inherently linked by Bernstein and Mahler and their belief that stories are what make music come alive. And what this evening showed me was that it is really true. There is a difference to listening to classical music on your phone and seeing it in person. It isn't brought to life. You need a conductor for that, you need an orchestra for that, and I'm so lucky to have seen this one as my first ever live concert.